Born in London in '86, a staff-show gent named Richard Parliament. He loves to wrestle, but he loves one more thing: handhelds round the world. He fights in his comments and he argues with fans. It's a problem no one understands. If there's two things he loves, it's getting handhelds round the world. Drinking fine wine, fighting fanboys, handhelds round the world.
Top Hat Gaming Man.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here, welcoming you to an exciting episode of Handhelds Around the World. Speaking of the world, after many months we are still living in a COVID-ridden hellhole with no signs of improvement. So therefore I have stuck to staying in jolly old England for at least the foreseeable future. As terrible as 2020 has been, at least we got Streets of Rage 4 though, the high quality 4th game in the Streets of Rage series that we have been waiting for many years. Speaking of Streets of Rage, whilst the original Mega Drive trilogy has always received plenty of attention, and rightly so, what some people may not necessarily be aware of is that the original Streets of Rage game was also available on other systems. In fact, there were 3 different versions of the first game in the series, all of which were programmed completely separately. Whilst I feel I have adequately given the famous Mega Drive version plenty of attention in the past, today I feel it is time to give its 8-bit counterparts some of the same love, as those iterations of the game deserve some respect too. After the incredibly successful release of a 16-bit version of the game on Sega's most powerful home console, Sega made the decision to create a port of the game for the Sega Game Gear. After all, Sega wanted to give players as many reasons as possible to opt for owning one of these babies over Nintendo's monochrome Game Boy. The Game Gear, released in late 1990, was an impressive piece of hardware that spec-wise absolutely blew the Game Boy out of the water. The magnificent system offered a full-colour backlit screen and superior processing power to Nintendo's humble handheld. As impressive as this thing was, there were issues that held it back from ever reaching its full potential, most notably its higher price point than the Game Boy, and the fact that it ate batteries in comparison. Further to this, when the system was rushed to market in 1990, Sega didn't even have strong enough IPs at the time to compete with Nintendo, and the Game Boy both already offered Tetris and Super Mario Land. By late 1991 though, Sega had the likes of Golden Axe, Streets of Rage and Sonic the Hedgehog all in their IP catalogues, leading to a Sonic game being developed for the Game Gear at the end of that same year. Further to this, Golden Axe would receive a game on the handheld too, but sadly only in the form of a bizarre action-adventure spin-off known as Axe Battler. In their quest to strengthen the Game Gear's arsenal, Streets of Rage would finally arrive on the system at the end of 1992, giving consumers a further reason to consider purchasing this flashy device. Before we dive deep into looking at this game, I would just like to give a quick shout out to my real life friends over at Wyatt & Wade's Needleworks for gifting me this dashing face covering to aid me in my fight against COVID-19. Want to look stylish while simultaneously preventing the annihilation of the silent generation? Why not check out my pals' Facebook page so they can make a mask for you featuring any design you want. Anyway, upon powering the game on, you receive the same Star Wars-esque text scroll cluing you in on the story that is present in the Mega Drive version. In regards to this, something else I must add is that Yuzo Koshiro's music on the 8-bit Game Gear handheld still sounds every bit as impressive as it does on the 16-bit hardware, and the opening track is of such high quality that it is surprising in a way that such sounds are coming from a 1990 pocket game system. Moving to the character select screen, experienced Streets of Rage players will instantly notice this game's first major omission. Fan favourite Adam has been dropped from the lineup, giving players a choice between just Axel and Blaze. If they had to drop a character though, it is no surprise it was him, considering he would not resurface as a playable character in later Streets of Rage entries until 29 years later, with the release of Streets of Rage 4. Moving on to round 1 of the gameplay, as you can see the programmers tried to do as good a job as possible with replicating the stage design found within the Mega Drive original. There are neon lights aplenty as well as many familiar enemy sprites. In this video the graphics may look very pixelated, however this limitation is barely noticeable when playing on a tiny Game Gear screen. Regardless of this, when gameplay is blown up to this size, the large pixels are somewhat charming anyway, giving the game that classic 8-bit feel. Something else you may notice is that amazingly Streets of Rage for the Game Gear can be played cooperatively using the Game Gear Link cable, which is pretty mental when you think about it, considering that for Game Boy and Super Nintendo owners, they could not even indulge in 2-player co-op fun even if they owned Final Fight. This is a strong prime example of Sega doing what Nintendo don't. From the first stage, as you can see, there are further elements carried over from the classic original, such as weapons that can be stolen from enemies, and phone boxes that can be smashed to grab items that replenish health or reward points. A lot of the spirit of the title has been successfully carried over. In the opening stage you even face off against the same stage boss as seen previously too. If you make it through the first round and make it onto round 2, you will notice that this game's round 2 looks very different to the one found in the 16-bit game. This is because round 2 and 3 found in the Mega Drive Classic have both been omitted from this game. Cartridge space is probably the most likely reason for this chunk of the game disappearing. Round 2 in this Game Gear game is a recreation of Round 4 from the Mega Drive title, aka the bridge stage. Speaking of limitations and stuff missing from the game, the character's knee smash grapple moves are also amongst the casualties. I still think though, what is here is pretty impressive, especially when you consider that most players were gaming on the simpler monochrome Game Boy when on the go. After making it to the end of the stage, a familiar fatty boom boom is the final hurdle to clear the area. Progression from this point follows the console original, moving on to the boat stage. The illusion of movement this time is not quite as immersive, although the programmers clearly tried. The end of a stage sees players face off against 2 palette swap blazes in another familiar encounter from the original. The factory level is next, which once again means the game reflects its 16-bit brother, and rather impressively the stage is still very much alive, offering many of the same obstacles such as moving conveyor belts and mechanical machinery that can crush the players. The boss fight in this one has been changed though, meaning players have to punch the fatty again. Now in the Mega Drive game, the next stage sees players riding a lift ascending a building to reach Mr. X. However, once again, like round 2 and 3 in the original, round 7 has also been omitted, thus meaning this version of the game only has 5 rounds, concluding with the final round taking place at the top of Mr. X's trump-like tower. The rest of the game unfolds much like you would expect. You grind your way through the halls of the building until you stumble upon Mr. X sitting in his throne-like chair, where you must take on the final wave of enemies that he calls upon. It does not seem that an alternate ending is present in this one, where the players become the new head of a crime syndicate. So this time round, Mr. X must simply be defeated. So that was the Streets of Rage game for the Game Gear, a title that certainly has a lot of elements missing that are present in the Mega Drive original, but still a title that in my opinion is a perfectly adequate game for a handheld gaming device from 1992. The Game Boy absolutely had nothing close to this. Still though, Sega were not done with their 8-bit Streets of Rage offerings, as it would not be long before they decided that it would be wise to port the game to their 8-bit Sega Master System. The Sega Master System, the device that predated the Mega Drive, was still a popular machine, and in fact after the release of Sonic the Hedgehog and Sega's spike in popularity, the Master System functioned as a great budget alternative device to that of the Mega Drive, particularly in Europe at the time, a region with a good amount of wealth where the NES had never managed to gain a stronghold. So it just made business sense to port Streets of Rage to the Master System too. However, there was still one issue. Porting the Game Gear version straight to the device would have been a bad idea, due to, as demonstrated earlier, the large pixels were not ideal for a home system that could be played on a large monitor. So therefore Sega would get to work on a third iteration of the game, bespoke for the Master System device. So let's take a look at the Master System version of the game that would hit Europe in 1993. The game opens up with the familiar by now text scroll, but this time around players are treated to a choice between 3 different playable fighters, meaning that thankfully Adam was actually included in this one. Upon diving into the actual gameplay, one of the first things you will notice is how stunning this game looks, especially considering it is on an 8-bit system. The title looks amazing and is a great showcase of what the Master System was graphically capable of. Now from here I guess I've likely got some smart Alex about to type about the PC Engine or TurboGrafx being 8-bit too. But the difference is that device had a 16-bit video color encoder and a 16-bit video display controller to help it out. The Master System on the other hand was 8-bit in every sense of the word. The bold colours and polished graphics that can be found in this game are far above anything that NES was capable of. Once again another prime example of Sega doing what Nintendo don't. When it comes to this game's improvements over its Game Gear predecessor, you will notice that when you progress to Round 2, this time you will actually get to experience a recreation of Round 2 from the Mega Drive game. One assumes the Master System's larger cartridges allowed the programmers to produce a bigger game this time around, so this entire stage was seen in 8-bit for the first time ever. Progressing to Round 3, it introduces another stage that was cut from the Game Gear version, as the player brawls along the seafront, which as expected looks bloody fantastic. Speaking of both of these stages, they both include the boss fights from the 16-bit version as well that were left out the Game Gear version. Now moving forward we get to play through multiple levels which were also in the Game Gear game. So from here let's take a moment to touch on this one's limitations. The game's most shocking and disappointing omission of all is the fact that this port of the game only allows for one player mode. Cooperative play was completely cut from this version, which personally I think is a very sad state of affairs, as the ability to play cooperatively in Streets of Rage is one of the game's largest appeals. I can't really think of any reason why this would be possible on the Game Gear but not the Master System other than pure laziness, or simply punishing the consumer for only owning the budget console. Who really knows? But let's be honest, if this version had have included co-op, it would have been a really fun inclusion purely on the basis that Master System children could have mocked SNES owners for their gimped version of Final Fight. But sadly, Streets of Rage for the Master System is gimped in this department too. It is also worth pointing out that with the Master System game, the programmers didn't even bother trying to replicate the illusion that the boat the player is fighting aboard is moving, something they did make the effort to try and achieve with the title's Game Gear counterpart, although it is still a stage of boats and hoes. Now, the industrial stage is very interesting, as rather than trying to recreate elements of the stage like they did with the handheld version, they actually changed things up somewhat, most notably with the inclusion of these waves of electricity that can now scorch the player, and most surprisingly of all, a brand new stage boss that is completely exclusive to this version of the game. This boss is perhaps the coolest looking in Streets of Rage history, and wears a bloody top hat to represent how freaking distinguished he actually is. This short fellow with well-groomed facial hair even has a frickin' rocket launcher on his back, making him vastly different to any of the other villains within the Streets of Rage canon. In fact, this is a Streets of Rage canon. We then get to play through another reinstated stage, the classic beat 'em up lift section from the Mega Drive Classic, with the inclusion of this convention adding another air of quality to this title. The final stage pretty much plays out how one would expect, as once again the player fights their way through the halls of Mr. X's Trump Tower before finally defeating the Uzi wielding maniac. Now reflecting back on both of these games, as you have now seen, they bring some very impressive elements to the table. The Game Gear version is a fully functioning two-player cooperative beat-em-up that allowed gamers to experience Streets of Rage on the go as early as 1992. The graphics even offered a unique visual appeal too. Then we have the Master System version of the game that not only included every stage from the Mega Drive version, but even some new elements and a brand new stage boss as well. Not only that, but the game is one of the most beautiful 8-bit titles I've ever seen, which could have easily functioned as perhaps one of the greatest 8-bit beat-em-ups of all time if it were not for the omission of two-player cooperative play, a feature I strongly feel is perhaps one of the most important to games from this genre. Now we've looked at both of these games in detail today. If you did not know much about these versions prior to this, I hope that I have now instilled an element of respect for these works in your mind. I definitely feel they deserve a little bit more credit for what they've achieved, bearing in mind the limited hardware each of which were developed for. Interestingly, this tale is actually one half told, as both the Master System and Game Gear would both receive Streets of Rage 2 conversions as well. So let me know in the comment section down below if you felt you got enough out of this to warrant me making a follow-up video. Speaking of Streets of Rage, I have a playlist on this channel covering the history of all of the Mega Drive games in depth, along with Streets of Rage 4 and some of the fantastic fan games too. But if you have seen all of that and you still want even more, then consider becoming a $5 backer on Patreon to receive access to my new weekly exclusive content, with a video this week giving a comprehensive look at the life of Blaze Fielding. Signing up not only gives you access to more content, but it also helps me work on this channel and all of these videos full time. Speaking of patrons, special thank yous and massive shout outs go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, The Murder of Crows, Heyo Paula Lopez, Joseph Razmik, Luke Samuel Denton, Corey Imar Sr., Capcom vs SNK, BXL Gotham, Rowan Dinched, Evan Border, Philip Mampf, Cambo Rambo 82, Azra Warakai, Keith Ferguson, Dropgrim Varela, Prince Knight, Michael Cullix, Ago, Jordan Duran, Angel Light 85, Alethea Swanson, Timothy W. Haskins II, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Glennie Glenn, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Kid Anime, Justin Wang, Aaron McNamara, Instant Gratification Monkey, Man Shovel, James Bishop, JB, Posty XL, Michael Hall, Wesley Sang He, Dwayne Pipe, Langston Miller, New, Brian Barry, Stephen Lewis, Sarah Powell, Flaming Renee, Marvin Araliga, Chris Cool, TOG Driver, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Richard Stu Stewart, James McDonald, Crazy Yarl, Dan Van Dammit, Adam Castin, Lewis Viant, John Bates, David Bale, Chris Fisk, Paul Elliott, Me Machine Dean, Mike Bruno, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Hans Christian, Craig Jenkins, Tom Elliott, Retroverse.com, Casey Wright, Synth Spaces, Zai, Andrew Bazansky and Gunther Hendricks. I would like to thank everybody so much who supports this channel. Yeah, cheerio!